Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today my 10 favourite other reads of 2024. So this is the final in a series of 4 videos I've done about my most memorable reads of 2024. So books I've read in 24 rather than books that necessarily came out this year. So the first was my 13 most disappointing reads this year. I then did my top 10 crime reads this year, then my top 10 horror reads this year, and this is my top 10 other reads, so books that are neither crime nor horror. And as with those other 2 top 10 videos, I'll list the books in no particular order, but the final book will be my favourite other book of the year. So let me get on with it then. So the first book I want to talk about is a book that came out this year in 2024, and that's I'm Starting to Worry About This Black Box of Doom by Jason Pargin. So this is a really fun kind of caper novel, but with a serious message to it as well. So it's about a guy who's like a Lyft driver, so like a taxi driver, who gets hired to transport this young woman and this mysterious box across the country. He's not allowed to ask her what's inside the box. He's not allowed to ask her who he is. He has to leave his cell phone behind. He's not allowed to have contact with anybody. And they go on this kind of cross-country drive across America. And whilst they do that, there's an explosion of interest in them. So he's a streamer, and people who have previously watched his streams and figure out that something weird is going on. And this whole kind of online culture almost springs up trying to figure out where they are, what's in the black box and things like that. So it's a really fun and humorous book, as you'd expect from Jason Pargin, who's a very, very funny guy. But it's also got a really serious message about kind of social media culture and the way social media shapes our lives, the way that like fake news and like weird stories can just take hold on social media, and people can make assumptions about things which end up being completely untrue. So a really interesting but very enjoyable read. Next up, something a bit older, Stoner by John Williams. So this is one of those books that everyone raves about, and I'm going to rave about it as well. I thought this was a fantastic book. So it's a book that's kind of about nothing. It's just about the life of this guy who's a university lecturer. It's about his time as a young man at university, how he came to be a lecturer. It's about his relationship with his wife and with his daughter. It's just a really interesting and intricate study of a life. And what's kind of wonderful about this book is just how mundane it is. Nothing really interesting happens to Stoner, the central character, and yet you become completely swept up in his life. It's a really, really wonderful book and definitely worth reading if you haven't read it already. Next, another older book, Shogun by James Clavell. So a huge book, probably huger than it needed to be, but absolutely fascinating. So a historical adventure novel about a British sailor who gets washed up on the shores of Japan and kind of becomes part of local Japanese society. So there's kind of a like conflict going on between various kind of local leaders who are all vying to become the new shogun, and he gets involved in that. So there's kind of huge battle scenes in this book. There's some fantastic kind of naval scenes and things like that as well. There's romantic elements. It's kind of one of those books that's got just a bit of everything, but it's also really a really fascinating examination of Japanese society at the time. So a great big doorstop of a book, but definitely worth reading. Next, something a lot slimmer and a non-fiction book, so the only non-fiction book on the list, and that is what we talk about when we talk about crime by Jennifer Fleetwood. So a really interesting series of essays about how crime is covered in the media, how we consider crime, how we talk about crime, how we discuss crime as a society. So it focuses on a number of high-profile cases and just talks about how the kind of narrative around the events of the crime was twisted by both the media and by people involved in the crime, so both the victims and the perpetrators of some of the crime. So it talks about how people kind of end up making careers about writing about their lives of crime and how they shape their own stories through that process. So a really, really interesting book and definitely one I recommend. Next, we have a book that I don't think is actually available. It was supposed to be published this year, and it's got stuck in some kind of publishing limbo, which is a real shame because it was a fantastically enjoyable read. So the book is A Dark and Subtle Light by the author Mark Hodder. So Mark Hodder, I would say, does have a load of other books out. I definitely need to read more by him. If you like the sound of this, do pick up something else by him that is available. So this is a book that's kind of a mix of science fiction and fantasy and horror and historical adventure. It's got a bit of everything. It features Machiavelli as a central character who is an immortal, so he can kind of go to sleep for long periods of time and then get woken up again to go on new adventures. And he has this team of kind of warriors who fight alongside him. In this book, which was, I think, supposed to be the first in a series, he goes up against this fascist commune in Europe. It's just a really fun adventure story. It's got loads going on in it. There's some very weird elements, but also just lots of kind of fun adventuring, and it's got a fantastic kind of team dynamic as well to that central team of characters. So a really enjoyable, gripping, tense read. Next then we have an older book, Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Susann. So this was a reread for me. I had read this years and years ago, and I'd forgotten quite how good it was. So it follows a group of women kind of in and around the entertainment industry over a number of decades. And it's just a really engrossing read. You really come to care about these women. It's definitely very over the top at times. It's really melodramatic and silly, but it's also really, really entertaining and interesting. Next up, another book like Shogun that's probably longer than it needed to be, Flicker by Theodore Roszak. I had a great time with this book though. It's a very strange read. It mixes kind of non-fiction and fiction in a really interesting way. So it's about a guy who's a film student who is like becomes fascinated by this director after seeing one of his movies. Most of his movies are lost, and a lot of the book is about the central character trying to discover these movies, trying to piece them together. So it becomes a book that's kind of about the history of cinema as well as being kind of a conspiracy thriller. It's endlessly fascinating. I found myself going down loads of rabbit holes while I was reading the book, trying to figure out which of the characters in the book were actually based on truth and which ones were completely made up. There's loads of film references and things like that. So it's a really engaging and interesting book to read. Probably not for everyone, but I absolutely loved it. Next up, another book like Stoner that everyone talks about, and that is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. So a fascinating dystopian book about this group of women who are kind of imprisoned in a bunker with male guards on the outside. It focuses on the youngest of the women and her experiences of this kind of strange world, and as the book unravels, you discover more and more about the kind of the backstory about how they came to be there. It's a really wonderfully written, really fascinating book that gripped me completely. I just literally couldn't put it down. It's very imaginative, very, very interesting. Next up, we have another mammoth of a book, The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell. So a book about the Holocaust, about the Second World War, told from the perspective of a guy who was a Nazi officer. So it's a very interesting but very, very disturbing book. Very graphic at times, definitely comes with a bunch of trigger warnings, but a really interesting examination of a particularly dark period of 20th century history. The central character is fascinating to read because he's so kind of deluded about his own involvement in the acts that went on. A really gripping book, very, very effective, and a book that I think justifies its huge length. Something like Shogun, I think, definitely could have been trimmed down, but I don't think The Kindly Ones would have had quite the impact it had on me if it was a smaller book. Part of the impact just comes from spending so much time with this central character and hearing about the atrocities he was involved in. And finally, my favourite other book of the year, a book by an author best known for her crime fiction, who I've been reading over the last couple of years. That is Patricia Highsmith. So I've come to hugely admire her work, and this is my favourite book by her. It's not a crime book, so most of her books are crime fiction. This one definitely isn't, but it is phenomenal. It's Edith's diary. So like Stoner, it's a book where kind of nothing happens. It's about this woman and her life, but Patricia Highsmith does such a fantastic job of portraying this woman. You really end up feeling like she's a real person. You really come to care for her. And the wonderful trick in this book is her diary. So her own interpretations of the events that you've seen as a reader take place in the book. It really adds an emotional impact in the book, and it's something that really, really stuck with me. So there you have my 10 favourite non-crime, non-horror reads of the year. Let me know your favourite book of the year in the comments. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.